Hello, and welcome to this episode of the QDU Academy for 2024. Today, we're going to be looking at the first round of the Grade 8 competition and the first long prep debate for Year 8s this year, which is that schools should offer dual learning systems of online and in-person learning. As always, with the first one for the year for any age group, we're going to cover a few things. Broadly, we're primarily going to talk about how to approach the debate before you even start writing your speeches. We're going to go over the context behind the debate and how to do your setup, which is referring broadly to both your definition and your model. Then we're going into a bit of notes about structuring points and practice, and then a couple of tips for this particular debate. So, the first thing to do is to look at what should you research before you even start writing your speeches for this particular debate? What is the context behind this debate? And the reason that we like to do this is that whenever you're doing a debate, you should always be trying to work out why has this topic been said and how much you can learn about that before you even begin writing speeches. For this debate, I think there are a few questions that you want to start off with. Firstly, what is a dual learning system? What does it mean to have two things occurring at the same time? Because that's broadly what you're probably going to find that the answer is to this question, that a dual learning system is a learning system that tries to accommodate multiple ways for people to learn in the same space, probably at the same time. You might find more specific definitions. You should search beyond just listening to the one I'm giving right now, but that's probably a very, very brief overview of what that is. The second thing is, what is an online learning system? There is also the question that goes along with this, which is, what is an in-person learning system? But I'm going to assume that most of you probably engage in in-person learning, so you probably already understand this quite well. But it is worth asking, what is an online learning system? There are probably a couple of different types of online learning systems. Some of them may be how you might have approached school during COVID, if you happen to have learning online during that time, when students were sometimes required to go into school via Zoom calls or Skype calls. And so that might be one way that you can learn online. Or an online learning system might be one where you do things very separately and by yourself. Maybe you are emailed work by a teacher and you do that work there, but you do not necessarily get fixed to the same timetable that people would in school. There are probably multiple different answers to this question, so search up to see what the different answers that you can find are that then you can learn about. A final question is, ask yourself where or when are they currently used together or have been used together in the past? I think one answer that's likely to occur is that it's very possible that at your school or at the school of people that you know, at some points during the COVID pandemic, there might have been individual students who were off school because they were individually quarantining. Maybe that meant that they were accessing school themselves from home at the same time as other people were in school. If you do know of any of these circumstances, ask yourself the question of, how did those things interact? Did they interact at all, in fact? And ask yourself also, can you research and find other places in the world or other times in history where they may have been used? The reason why this is useful is because it will help you understand where they could be used in the future and whether it is important that they are always accessible. So once you've started setting up the debate, you have a good understanding of what the debate is about, you've asked yourself some questions beforehand and you've done some research beforehand, the next thing to do is to start actually writing the bit that goes before the arguments of the first speaker's speech. And the first thing that you do there is you want to look at a definition. So, as you can see on the screen, you want to go through the topic and highlight keywords and come up with definitions for them. Some topics are going to have lots of words like this. Some of them are going to have very few words. I think this is a debate that probably actually has quite a few words. The first one is schools. Schools can mean a few things in debating. It can mean primary schools, it can mean high schools, it can mean both. In my personal opinion, I think usually when topics refer to schools, it is better to make it apply to all schools rather than only some schools, for the reason that, firstly, your opposition may disagree with you as a negative team. They may have written arguments that specifically apply to high schools, and if you write a definition that only applies to primary schools, the debate is going to get incredibly messy. But also, I think it makes your arguments weaker sometimes when you build in exceptions to a definition while you're writing your speeches. And I think it's probably useful to be able to say, these arguments apply to primary school and high school, so we're going to define schools as being both. However, this is just my opinion. You may find that in your understanding of the debate, it is easier, or it makes more sense, I should say, for you to define it as, I would say, definitely high school because you are in high school, but also possibly primary school operates differently if you can come up with a good reason to exclude it rather than just because you feel like it. The second thing is to define what a dual system is. While dual system is earlier in the topic, which is why it shows up earlier on the screen, you probably actually want to define it after you've defined the next two things, which are you want to define what online learning is, you want to define what in-person learning is, and once you know what the two things are, you can define what a dual system, a system therefore meaning two things, that is going to use both of them is going to look like. So you want to explain how exactly those things interact and what those terms mean. Next thing to look at is your model, which is how you are going to do the thing in the topic. Sometimes you'll find that your model crosses over quite heavily with the definition. That's okay, that's normal. But now you need to work out specifically, not just what do the words in the topic mean, but how are you as an affirmative team going to do that thing in the topic. I think that the very big question that you need to ask in this particular debate is how you are going to combine systems of online and in-person learning. I think that how you are going to combine them is slightly going to be judged by what you believe the current problem in the status quo is. What I mean by that is that in any should debate, an affirmative team tends to be trying to solve a problem. And so you want to make sure that when you're writing a model and when you're writing arguments, you can really clearly explain how you solve that particular problem. Now, the choice an affirmative team has in this debate is kind of whether a school is going to offer two systems of learning and they will happen at the same time, but they might not interact particularly heavily, to a system where they interact incredibly heavily. Say, for example, when a teacher is asking questions, there is also a Zoom screen that everyone can see where people are raising their hands and they are interacting quite a bit. Or maybe during group work, do you think that people are going to be joining in on group assignments but on Zoom with in-person students? Or do you think all of the online persons are going to be doing their group assignment together and all of the in-person people will just be with in-person people? The reason this is slightly guided by what the problem you're trying to solve is that perhaps you say that the current problem is that students are not interacting with people online, and that if you live particularly far away, it's difficult for you to go to certain schools that are in the big city or something like that. And it's important that we can sort of understand each other more. If that's the problem you're talking about, it's probably incredibly important that you are able to have everyone access each other, whether they're online or in-person students, because the social aspect of combining it all is really necessary. However, if the bigger problem you see is, say, for example, that when students are sick, it is difficult for them to access school because they are at home from school, it might be less important because then when they are healthy again, they will just go to school and then they can see all of their friends again. It's a bit guided by why you think people are going to be using the online system, and that's going to slightly inform how you want those systems to combine. As a negative team, you also have a couple of choices. And this is where we get onto counter models. A counter model is when a negative team tries to find a different way of solving the affirmative team's problem, or providing just something else that is going to improve the world as well. So as a negative team, you are going to be slightly guided by what you think the problem with a dual learning system is. If you think that the problem with a dual learning system is that it's really difficult to combine the two things together, and that it makes sense that there would be some schools that can offer in-person learning and there will be different schools that can offer online learning, but they shouldn't be the same school, you might then have a counter model which is just that, which is that students could access online learning, but in a specific online learning school. However, if you thought that the bigger problem was actually just that one of those two systems was bad, say for example that online learning is bad because it keeps kids out of the classroom and it doesn't let them make friends with people, then maybe you'd say that actually we just do not want online learning at all, regardless of whether it is combined or if it is separate. So think about what you think the big problem with a dual learning system is. Is it that it is combined, or is it that one of the systems independently is bad? That will inform a bit whether you want to have a strong counter model in one direction or another. Having now gone through the process of setting up the debate, thinking about why is this debate taking place, what can I research about this debate, defining keywords, and creating a model and a counter model, the next thing to do is to start to write your arguments. Now, this is a good point in the video probably to pause and to just write some arguments, think about it, brainstorm it, and then in a bit I'll get onto some things about how you can turn those arguments into being written incredibly well. But this is something where I will give you a couple of tips as to how you might want to approach brainstorming arguments. Think about different groups that might be affected by dual learning systems. Think about students, think about teachers, think about school administrators, think about parents. All of those groups are probably affected in slightly different ways. So they might be ways that you can come up with different arguments as to how each of them is separately affected. It might be that you also think that there are multiple problems with the current state of affairs without dual learning systems. And that means you can have multiple points about how you solve each of the problems. These are some good ideas of where you might start your point, but I don't know exactly where your point is going to end up. And so it's a good point now as we move on to the next slide, which is sharing ideas, which is something that you can do if you join us for the sessions as they occur on Tuesday afternoons. But if you are just watching this as a YouTube video, you probably cannot share your ideas with me personally. So I'd recommend pausing the video now. If you happen to be in a group of students watching this together, share your ideas with each other. If you're watching this by yourself, write your ideas down so that you can share them with your team when you get into your next meeting. Okay, cool. Now that we're back and that you've shared your ideas if you want to, or you've just written down some thoughts, we now get on to structuring arguments. When you're structuring arguments, there are a couple of things that I think makes debating particularly interesting in structuring arguments. Because you probably know that debating is a bit like a persuasive essay at times, in that you are trying to persuade an adjudicator to believe something, and that therefore you are trying to prove, you're going through sort of your essay type structures, your points, your explanations, your evaluations, your examples, and then your topic sentences in some order. Your school probably has some acronym that explains this. I've come across things like TEEP, I've come across things like Oreo that structure these arguments. I think that there's one thing that makes debating a bit different from an essay question in terms of how you might want to structure an argument. And the reason for that is that in debating, you are not just trying to persuade an adjudicator, but you are also competing against another team trying to persuade the adjudicator of the exact opposite thing at the same time. So that means that there are two things that you want to try and do when structuring an argument, which is you want to state your point, but you then want to explain why is this claim true? What are the logical reasons that mean that your claim is likely to be true? And then you can also use things such as evidence and examples that back this up. What does this look like? Let's say, for example, that you're saying that having dual systems of online and in-person learning is better for students who are at home sick from school. Why is this true? Because currently they cannot access school because they are sick, and the school does not give at-home resources to access school online when they might be not quite sick enough to be completely bedridden and asleep, but they're also too sick to actually go into school because they might be contagious. This looks like a student that has a mild case of the flu that actually kind of wants to learn, but currently can't because they might infect their friends, and they are currently locked home from school. So you see how I've explained that that's true, but the next thing that you need to do is you also need to persuade the adjudicator that your point is really important. And this is the competitive part of debating, that both teams will say lots of true things, but often debates are won and lost by who can persuade the adjudicator that what they have proven is the more important thing. So this is where it's useful to say, and the reason why it's so important that we help students that are at home sick from school is that if they cannot get school while they are at home and they would be learning online, they will fall behind, and then they might perform worse in their exams, and this can snowball into making it a lot less fun to be at school if they do not know as much as their peers. You see how at that point I've explained something that's true. I've also given a reason why it's super important, which is also going to mean that if the other team gives an argument that's also very true, it's difficult for them to overcome the fact that my argument is also important. So I think that that's how you should think about structuring arguments. Use any essay structure that you feel comfortable using, but always ask yourself the question, why is this true and why is this important, to make sure an adjudicator is very persuaded. And then the converse of this is often true when we come to responding to arguments. Rebuttal is often quite a scary thing in debating when you're especially quite new to it, but there are some good things that I think you can use to make rebuttal a bit less intimidating. So if we think that an argument is often very persuasive to an adjudicator, when it is very true and it is very important, an argument is probably very unpersuasive when it is untrue and it is unimportant. So what you should try and do in rebuttal is write down what the other team is saying and write down why you think that they think their argument is true and why you think that they think their argument is important. Persuade the adjudicator that that's not the case, that their argument is untrue, that the reason they think that their argument is important is actually unimportant. At that point, you will successfully take down the other team's argument. A couple of things that you should avoid doing in rebuttal is you should avoid trying to just use your own argument to rebut their argument. That's not because your own argument isn't a good piece of analysis, but it's because your own argument, the adjudicator probably has already made their mind up about it, and an adjudicator can sort of compare arguments themselves. What's really useful is to give a new idea that can specifically rebut their argument. That will be more likely to change the adjudicator's mind. Another thing that you should deliberately do is you should avoid rebutting point labels. You should always rebut the reason behind the point label. Say, for example, if we go back to the affirmative arguments that I gave before, if I claim that we should have dual learning systems because it is easier for students who are at home sick from school, and that is the entire point, the adjudicator might believe it a bit, but they would not believe it much because I have not given a reason for it. For the same reason, that's why it's not very good to just rebut that claim, because that claim is not persuasive. The reason it's persuasive is when I explain the circumstances that cause a student to be at home sick from school and why it's so important that they do not fall behind. So make sure you rebut the part of the argument that is going to persuade the adjudicator, because that's how you can persuade them of the opposite. Now, at this point in the presentation, we would ask for questions for the students that have logged in to the QDU Academy sessions on Tuesday afternoons. Obviously, if you're watching this as a YouTube video, you cannot immediately ask questions to us. But if you do have questions about this session or about debating in general, make sure that A, if you can, you log into the next episode of the QDU Academy whenever the next one for your age group is, probably in about 3 weeks from when this one was made. I do not know exactly when you are watching this, so I don't know how long it is from your point in time, but it is on Tuesday afternoons. Ask your debating coordinator at school when that is. Or get your debating coordinator to reach out to the QDU with any questions you have, or ask your adjudicator at your next debate. Finally, you have probably already found the QDU YouTube channel if you're watching this, as this is a YouTube video. But if you have some questions, some of them may be able to be answered by other videos on the YouTube channel, particularly if you have questions about how different types of debates work, or if you have questions about how different types of arguments work. You're in year 8, so they're less relevant, but there are some senior A ideas such as and senior debating ideas such as points of information there are videos about. So if other people from your school are asking about these kinds of ideas, there is probably a QDU YouTube channel video that answers something related to what you are wondering. So you've already found this, but there are good resources on it, so keep looking for it in the future. And finally, thank you very much for watching this video. We hope that you do well in this debate, have fun, and continue debating in the future.